Good afternoon. I'm Kathy Leonard, President of Freeman+Leonard, and I want to welcome you to our webinar series, The Business of Marketing. Freeman+Leonard is a marketing services firm that specializes in 3 lines of business. One is consulting, agency services, and talent placement. To learn more about Freeman+Leonard, we invite you to go to our website at www.freemanleonard.com. Today we're kicking off our Business of Marketing webinar series by focusing on change management with a presentation titled Leading the Change. And presenting for us today, Leading the Change, is Freeman+Leonard Game Changer and Strategic Consultant Steve Schewe. A little bit about Steve. Armed with a BA in Economics from Yale and an MBA from the Darden School at the University of Virginia, Steve began his career with Morgan Stanley in the Mergers and Acquisitions Department. Over the years, he's worked with such companies as Norwest Venture Capital and Cray Research. Steve was Vice President of Strategic Marketing for Atrium, a publicly held semiconductor equipment manufacturer. Steve has led the change for companies in categories like financial services, manufacturing, healthcare, and technology. We are very proud to have him kick off our Business of Marketing series. And during the course of the presentation, if you have questions, please type those into the chat bar and we'll address your questions at the end. Thank you for joining us, and now I'm going to turn it over to Steve Schewe. Steve?
Kathy, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. We're going to talk a bit about change management and how to create a change management plan today. So what you'll learn is how to evaluate and assess a situation for change that you can use in your organization, either with your employees or your channel partners, your vendors or your customers. And we'll break that plan into a series of steps that can help keep you on track. At the end of the talk, I will also provide you with some lists of books and articles and links that you can download. But as Kathy said, to the extent that you all want to ask questions as we go, we're going to try to save some time at the end so that we'll be able to give you time to ask some questions and for us to have a dialogue. So let's start by talking a bit about what you had to say to us. We did survey the group before we started, and one of the questions that we asked was what benefits of managing change more effectively would mean the most to you. Thank you for your responses. Those of you who talked to us about that basically said you were looking for fewer conflicts about your strategy and direction within your organization and greater trust earned with your employees and customers. And as I think you'll see as we go, that's a pretty common agenda for an awful lot of people who are faced with change-related situations. We also asked you to choose between 2 important areas for improving performance in your company. And by far the biggest response was for better business systems and processes. So we'll focus a bit on that as we go as well. So the agenda for today: why should you change? How do you assess the stages of change, including people's emotions and potential resistance? How do you identify the behaviors needed for a successful change? Designing a change management plan, and then launching and sustaining the change. So that's kind of our basic approach and the tools that we're going to be talking about during the course of the hour. So starting with this, why is change hard? You know, Newton's first law of motion says that an object in motion in one direction tends to remain in motion, and an object at rest tends to remain at rest, which is also called inertia. So in effect, change is in some ways against the laws of nature. No one wants to change unless they become convinced that they have to. I always think at the beginning of a talk like this about situations where I've had difficulty changing myself. I can remember a number of years ago, there's a hill 2 blocks from my house with a stop sign. And I used to go to work early in the morning kind of preoccupied, and I would roll up to that stop sign and sort of go through it. Usually there was nobody there, but there came a morning where there was a squad car sitting there ready to give me a ticket for rolling the stop sign. And the lesson that I thought I learned from that was I have to stop rolling the stop sign. 2 days later, I came back and got to the stop sign and looked to my right, and the squad car was there again. And my brain told me to stop, but my foot was already letting go of the brake pedal to let me roll through the stop sign. The officer came up to me with a smile and said, "We've been seeing a lot of you this week, Mr. Schewe." So I finally concluded that I needed to change not only the way I rolled that stop sign, but the way that I drove, and I made some specific changes to try to be able to manage that. But it took a little bit of pain in order for me to get to the point where I was willing to think hard about why that was happening and what I needed to do differently. The thing about change, though, is that transformations are happening all around us all the time, whether we like it or not. You know, the world is changing with its technology and customers and employees. This medium that we're using for this meeting today, the World Wide Web, if it was a person, it'd be barely old enough to vote in most countries. But I think about how much it has changed the way that we do business. There's a great, scary example in this morning's newspaper. I don't know how many of you saw Tom Friedman's column. He writes for the New York Times. But he mentioned that South America's biggest and wealthiest city, Sao Paulo, may run out of water by mid-November if it doesn't rain soon. So we're talking about a city of 20 million people suffering its worst drought in 80 years, and the key reservoirs around the city have all dried up. It's testimony to inertia that the main response, apparently, when you ask people about this in Sao Paulo, Friedman says the common response is, "We hope it rains." So I think we could all agree that managing change before the faucets run dry would be a better response. Often your company must change to grow. Here are some common reasons why organizations need new energy. New employees may be unaware of your priorities. They may need new approaches or skills or tools to be able to do what you want them to do. The easy benefits of things happening in your organization have already been realized. And it's often the case now that people are complementing what has been a strong focus on cost reduction with a focus on improved margins from better products and improved customer experiences. I know I've just spent the last 2 months working with a company that's in the building products area, which because of the recession was really kind of at a low ebb for many years, and all of a sudden they're seeing an explosion in demand. So they're working not only to make their plant more efficient and more cost productive, but they're also looking outside at their customers and customers' needs and are beginning to think about how they can become more outside in as opposed to just inside out. The more successful companies have been, typically I find the harder it is for organizations to change when they need to because of either new technologies, changes in consumer behavior, changes in channels or employees, competitive advances, or the kind of global shifts that so many companies are seeing in their businesses. Here's a concrete example of something that you may see with your employees. One of the things that we've noticed is that people may leave the company if it doesn't keep up with the times. And here's some survey data that I have access to that talks about answers to questions. I am planning on leaving my organization in the next 12 months. And you can see where people fell out on that by the age cohort. So you can see the baby boomers were a lot more invested in staying with their current situation than the folks who are in Gen Y or in Gen X, who are shown up at the upper left-hand side of the chart. You can see that many more of them strongly agreed with the possibility of leaving. Boomers tend to be nearing retirement, so they're not really at a point where they can switch or would want to switch easily. But the Generation Y or millennial folks still have a more flexible notion of what their career trajectory might look like. And of course, if you don't figure out how to meet their needs, they're going to go somewhere else. It's another great example of why you need to make changes. So what is change management? I think of change management as the energy to align your organization's people and culture with your business strategy, your systems changes, and with your organizational structure. So often management or leadership will spend a lot of time thinking about how they want to win in the marketplace without thinking about the corresponding need to engage their employees to be able to do that, or even to engage their channel partners or their suppliers or their customers. Typically, change management plans organize information so that it can be understood and embraced by those facing the change. A good plan will create a design where the results can be measured, because part of what you want to do with a change is to monitor, adjust it so that it can be sustained. And why do this? The return on investment as a workforce, including the people who are in management, who are aware of the need for change, understand what needs to be changed, embrace a new set of behaviors like I did when I stopped rolling the stop sign, and eventually gets to the point where they advocate for those new behaviors or that new strategy. So here are some tools that you can think about using as you begin the first part of the process, which is assessing where your organization is currently. I think of them almost like mirrors of change. So you can see the organization goals, the customer moments of truth, and what your ideal response is, a force field analysis of the resistance to change, behavioral changes by department, behavioral changes by job role, stages of change in the organization, and then your current state of engagement. So let's go through these one-on-one and talk a bit about how they might be useful to you. And again, part of my approach to this is to keep it as simple as possible so that almost anyone in your organization can use it effectively. And in fact, the groups that I was telling you about that I was working with in the building products industry, once we'd gone through the change process, they were actually talking about how they could drive this process down to the people who were working on their manufacturing floor or who were manning the customer service phones or even loading the trucks with material. So think through as we talk how you might be able to use something like this not only with your leadership team, but also potentially with your employees in the organization. So here's some more feedback from the survey. We asked the question, what are the most important changes that will be important goals for your business in the next 18 months? And by far, the largest number was adding new customers. That seems to be one of the areas that people really want to focus on. So let's talk about your organization's goals to begin with. Here's a list of some of the things that come to mind for me. Keep in mind that one can have too many goals. A lot of the times when I work with organizations, I will say that we were made with 5 fingers or 4 fingers and a thumb for a reason. That most people, when they count beyond 5, have a hard time keeping track in any meaningful way of the other things that they're thinking about doing. So when you look at this worksheet, or when you think about your own organization's goals, what do you want to pursue in your organization? Further then, once you decide that, you can think about the customer experience and the moments when this change will become visible to them. Ideally, the inputs provided by your company generate an ideal state with the customer. When it all goes well and the customer becomes loyal to you, even recommending you to others. So what would that look like for you? I've put an example here in the deck just to kind of walk through some of the key stages that might happen for an agency like Freeman+Leonard. So to begin with, Freeman+Leonard provides a certain market presence because they're looking for the opportunity to provide agency services. And when it goes well, they're selected to provide information to respond with a proposal or with a bid. Once they do that, they may, you may, as the customer, be involved in providing product and applications knowledge. You're trying to evaluate potential partners. So Freeman+Leonard would have to come back showing what their capabilities, their past performance, and their references will be in order to win the business. Once that's done, there may be a situation where Freeman+Leonard is trying to transfer knowledge or capability to a particular client. So how or where do they provide training on how to learn to use or to benefit from that service so that the service is accepted into the client organization? And then you could imagine a situation where the client begins to scale up use of that service to solve a problem, and the need for on-time error-free service becomes critical, so that Freeman+Leonard is supporting them in that situation to turn a trial client into a client that is loyal because of the availability of the support capability and the benefits that they're seeing from that service. So you could use a series of templates similar to the ones that I'm showing you to go through and define some similar moments of truth for your organization. Finally, there might be a follow-up situation once you have a client satisfaction and you've gotten to the point where they're willing to offer you the opportunity for more business. So having thought through your goals, here's another potential mirror. How would you identify specific behaviors from different departments in your organization to be able to deliver the customer experience that will drive those moments that we've been talking about. So you could conceivably go down through this list and think about whether it's the people in your organization, people specifically providing the products or services, people doing promotion for you or distribution or pricing, people who are operating the advertising and social media capability, people who are providing talent management and skills, shipping and installation, training and service, business systems. These are simple building blocks for strategy. So if you can break your strategy down into step-by-step behaviors, think about what do the people do in these departments now to facilitate that customer moment of truth, and what behaviors should happen in the department in order to deliver those moments more effectively. So you can almost think of this as analysis that shows what people are doing today, and from there, where do they need to go in order to be able to successfully implement the strategy that you're talking about. Now, one of the key challenges we heard about from you was that maintaining the momentum of a change initiative is probably the most difficult part of creating change, and I would agree with that. People tend to put a lot of energy into an initial launch, but then they may not be able to follow up for a variety of reasons. Some employees or some customers may perceive that what you're offering is the flavor of the month, and they either don't go through the process of becoming more aware, or the employees feel like they can ignore you until you get distracted by something else. Others may think by experience that even though you're trying to do something to change the way they work, they can wait you out. I know I talked to a client earlier this week who's trying to implement a new software system in a factory. Outwardly, the plant manager promised this client full cooperation, but in the actual event of the week, his staff would confirm their attendance at key meetings and they would not show up or come late. And the change team was sequestered in an out-of-the-way conference room that was too small for them to work in effectively. So the manager was saying one thing in terms of his support, but doing others. And I bet a lot of you listening on the call have probably had that experience with people that you've been trying to influence. And then, of course, you have the process of how do you go through and confront someone like that to figure out what's really on their mind, what the potential sources of resistance might be. So as you think about situations like the ones I've been describing, you can imagine that it really does take more than a good idea to win, right? It takes implementation of strategy to everyone in your organization. And I believe that has a lot to do with engagement. And the roots of engagement are people's emotional drivers. So think for a moment with me. What motivates you? What motivates your employees? What motivates your customers? Common motivations that I see include fear, economic self-interest, let's call that greed, a desire for pleasure. Higher level motivations might include pride in your work, a desire to belong to a larger group, a wish to commit to something bigger than yourself, perhaps even a desire to leave behind a legacy. Which of these emotional drivers are strongest for you personally? Which do you think are strongest for your people? When you begin to think about those, you can start to say, what sort of engagement strategy will link up most effectively with the emotional drivers of the people that I see around me that I'm trying to influence? And you can begin to encourage specific changes in behavior that will drive results with tactics that drive those behaviors. So we always run into resistance when we're trying to do behavior change. We've talked a little bit about it already. But what are some of the things that we might see? So for example, there is a question that we'll come back to in a minute called where people are in the stages of change. I think it requires often for people to go through 3 different stages, which I'll talk about in a minute. And people may not be far enough down the line in order for them to be able to make the changes that you're desiring until they've gone through those stages. Another issue related to potential resistance is the perceived commitment of senior leadership. How much do your employees or your team feel like you're actually behind the change as opposed to feeling like you have to communicate it because you're getting pressure from somewhere else? Is there cross-functional alignment? Are the people in the different parts of the organization coordinated and saying the same thing? It's not unusual for that not to happen, at least in the beginning stages of a change process. What sorts of relationships and trust do you have with your business partners? This is another area where people often get tripped up because they're looking for a change that requires a higher level of purpose and trust than they may be experiencing in their current partner relationships, which might be, for example, more transactionally based. What's the compensation and the talent development alignment with the change that's being required? I can remember being in a room with a whole bunch of banking executives a few years ago where the CEO came in and pitched a cross-selling program that he wanted to make a reality within their culture, where basically the products of Salesforce A were going to be sold by or referred to by Salesforce B. He walked out of the room, and I was sitting behind a couple of guys who turned to each other, and one of them said, "Now, I heard what he just said, and you heard what he just said, but remember how we get paid." So that, the incentive compensation process and the process that people understand of what will advance them inside of an organization often takes over and even dominates a particular change or engagement strategy, even that might be coming from the highest level of the business. And then further, there are potentially cultural issues, organizational issues, or geographic issues that cause change to be resisted. And finally, the things that we talked about before: fear, greed, pride, cynicism, the things that we all struggle with. One thing that I sometimes find helpful is to look at this through a map. And I've got an approach that I sometimes use called a force field analysis. This comes back to that cross-selling example that I gave you before. I'll lay out the behaviors that I'm trying to get people to do in the middle column. So if the goal is to increase cross-selling, we might want to identify opportunities for other business units, fill out a referral form, make sure that referral gets assigned, making sure that the assignee actually follows up with not only the customer or prospect, but also the referrer, ideally to make a joint sales call, making sure the sale gets made, and then making sure that the referrer qualifies for whatever incentive was being provided so that it can be paid after management approves it. So those might be a series of behaviors that you're trying to get to. Now, on the other hand, there may be drivers that are helping you with that, like that senior manager or CEO that I was telling you about, standing up and saying, this is something that I want my whole organization to do. Ideally, there will have been some pilots or some near-term successes where specific leading adopters can get up and talk about how they've done this and why it's effective. In this case, it was a relationship sell at the C-level, and that was a natural thing for the senior salespeople to be able to do. And finally, there was a recognition of value, that if a customer bought multiple lines from this particular financial services company, the relationship was going to get stickier. There was going to be more loyalty if they had more product commitments to this particular company. So those were things that were driving the behaviors that in effect were tailwinds behind the behaviors. Now, unfortunately, as is often the case, there were also headwinds or barriers. In this particular case, as I mentioned, there was a cultural emphasis on the results of the individual business line where the people sat. There were limited individual and business unit goals to promote cross-selling. There were legacy channel relationships. So Salesforce A had prior relationships with not just Salesforce B, but with a channel partner outside the organization that had provided that same service to them. And some of them did not want to let those relationships go. There were also struggles about account ownership. This was a funny situation. You could literally walk into a room of several hundred people and pick out who the senior salespeople were that had the relationships with the community banks. Those were the folks that needed to make the referrals. And then the younger, I'd say less finished group that was supposed to be selling the services that were going to be referred. And you could almost just tell by looking at these two groups of people that they weren't automatically going to trust each other, that there was going to need to be some significant communication and trust building just to get to the point where the senior salespeople were ready to make those referrals. And then finally, there were no specific standards on lead qualifications, so some of the early leads were not consistent quality in a way that caused people to want to continue to follow up on the leads. And there was a complex, slow pay process for the people who successfully made referrals. So I might make a referral, and even though there was a sale, I might not get anything back for that in quite a while, and to the point that it made me less likely to want to be able to make a future referral. So as you can see, sometimes it's good to visualize the forces that are arrayed for and against change in your organization, because it can help you begin to get a sense of what sorts of elements that you need in your program to be able to actually make the change stick, to make it sustained. Now, I mentioned earlier the concept of stages of change. This is another way to assess the dynamics of change going on in your organization. If you look at this curve, it maps different stages over time and how a degree of ownership or trust in the change builds. I think there are often 3 stages to change. People will begin in a superficial way by becoming aware of the change. They may hear about it, but they may not accept it. To get into the second stage, they have to put it into their own conceptual framework. Do they really believe it? Is it something that they're willing to not only understand, but to accept and eventually get to the point where they're ready to defend it? And then finally, have they emotionally internalized it? Are they actually living the change to the point that they're ready to promote it, personalize it, even advocate for it as an ambassador, either inside your organization or with your channel or with whatever group needs to continue to go through the change process? The crucial points here are that each of us starts in a different place, and we move up a curve like this at different rates. Some of us won't move at all. So part of change work involves helping organizations compress the amount of time that it takes for their people to travel through these stages of change. Another piece within that is the whole question of what happens when different parts of the organization get the message at different times. I often think about this quote from Lord Chesterfield, the idea that patience is a most necessary quality for business. Many people would rather you heard their story rather than granted their request. Imagine that you've just acquired another company. As a senior leader, you may have analyzed and negotiated for 6 months or more to bring the deal to life. You're already an advocate for this change. And then you walk out into the public area of your office and announce the merger to your employees. Think about that curve that we just looked at. They're all right at the beginning of awareness of the change. How much patience, how much listening will be required on your part? Can you remember the arguments and tactics that helped you when you were first struggling with understanding and accepting the possibilities of this acquisition? That dysfunction or disalignment around acquisitions is one of the critical reasons why acquisition integration might be the most difficult of change management challenges. Because leaders have to keep in mind that different levels of the organization are almost always at different phases of accepting the change. And they need different tactics for each level. There are specific and similar dynamics at work in other campaigns for change, but this is one of the starkest ones that I know. So in summarizing this section, it's critical to think about the emotions of your organization. For most of us who went into management, it's not the first place we go. We tend to be rational. We like to make decisions based on facts and logic rather than the messiness of the human heart, of motivation. But it turns out that most of why we make decisions is bound up in emotions. It's an important challenge to those who would change their organizations. And I love this quote by Chip Heath, who's a professor out at Stanford Business School and is the author of a book called Switch. He was interviewed at one point and talked about the fact that at work, our rational side may say that the company needs to go in a different direction, but the emotional side is comfortable with the old ways of thinking and selling, and it has great anxiety about whether the company can change successfully. He also refers to the rational desire to eat less, to lose weight, but the emotional side that's addicted to impulse or comfortable routines, that pleasure motivation that we talked about earlier, and that side wants a cookie. Those kinds of emotions may not even be totally conscious to the people that you're working with, But there's a popular and old metaphor of this, that in many ways when we're trying to do change, it's a little bit like someone trying to ride an elephant. The rider is much smaller than the elephant, and you can spend a lot of energy trying to steer the elephant without a lot of success other than just wearing yourself out in the process. The critical thing around finding the emotions is trying to figure out what it is that's making the elephant go in the direction that it's going in, and then to see what you can do to influence it without trying to tell it what to do. So what are some of the tools that you can use to begin to drive that kind of change? I think there are at least 5 buckets that you can put tactics into. The first is to create awareness through communication. So if somebody doesn't know what's required of them, you can tell them. Sometimes you need to tell them repeatedly and in lots of different ways before they get the message. Depending on what their background and their values are and what their experience has been with the leadership or the trust or lack of trust that they have in the organization, you can imagine that they may respond in that first stage in different ways. But let's say we get them to the point where they know what it is that you want them to do. Another bucket of change that's important is they may know, but they may not know how. And in that case, we need to try to help them develop some specific skills through learning and training. Once we've done that, there probably are going to be opportunities to begin to integrate the change into the way that we do business, the rhythm of the company, if you will, through the policies and procedures of the company. And as people begin to adopt the change, you can build desire in the whole population by providing recognition or rewards. It's the kind of thing we do when we're trying to create change at the customer level, where we do a customer testimonial with someone and invite someone to get some free media or free recognition on our behalf. What we're doing in that situation is recognizing them for the positive decision they've made, perhaps to be the first to jump on board at a new product launch and to encourage the other people. And then finally, you can sustain the change through measurement and holding people accountable. Often that's the most popular tactic or the most popular bucket that people draw from. But as you can imagine, if you use these 5 buckets unequally, if, for example, the organization tends to be heavily driven by measurement and by accountability without taking into account tactics from the other buckets, you can imagine that the change effort is going to be pulled out of alignment or out of proportion just because you're only touching one part of people's motivations in that particular case. So as you think about an engagement plan, one of the things that you want to consider is balance. How do I begin to create a plan that touches people on a number of different levels with a number of different tools? Ideally, this will result in what some people think of as a plan to win for their specific jobs. What can the individual people do on a daily basis when they come to work, if it happens to be an employee plan, that advances the change that you're leading the organization towards? Another way to think about this is to map how you think people are accepting the strategy and why. So this is an example, again, of using the stages of change, where I actually worked with a leadership team to think about where they were relative to the other people who had functional responsibilities in the organization. And as you can see, we basically went through an exercise where we had them put dots on a chart based on where they thought the different functions were. And it quickly became clear that there were a whole bunch of people at the junior levels of the organization who had barely realized what it was that was being required of them, much less understanding and accepting it. And it's a great example of how a leadership team can be somewhat out of phase at the beginning with the rest of their organization, that they may need to help them to catch up. So how do we do that? Well, one way, again, is to come back to the idea of looking at jobs in different parts of the organization like we did earlier, and to begin to sketch out those specific behavior changes. So using the same list of behaviors we made earlier by department and by role in the organization, start with you and where you fit, and then go through the other roles that deliver specific things for the customer. What must each of your people do differently in order to be able to make the change real for customers? And this is a good way to begin to break this down in a very concrete way, if I'm trying, for example, to be more guest-friendly or more customer-friendly, what do the different parts of the organization need to do differently in order for the customer to have that experience? So here's another example. This is a situation where a company was trying to move from being strictly product-focused to becoming more solution-oriented. And you can get an idea of some of the things that are needed not only in terms of behaviors, but also in terms of leading and lagging indicators. Leading and lagging indicators are good because that's what we're usually evaluated on. We're most familiar with the lagging ones, sales, profit, customer satisfaction, because they're easier to measure. They do tend to be harder to influence, though. Once you've got the number, you can't go back and change it very easily. When you're managing change, it's critical to establish some leading measures, the ones that predict goal achievement. Think of them almost as a barometer of successful change. What will happen once the forecast or the barometer shows that there's change occurring? If you can define those harder to measure indicators, you can coach and counsel your people in real time and influence the outcome more quickly. So as an example, if the leadership is initially about setting quotas and advertising for performance, and they hire and train people who can demo and service people who can fix, their sales proposition is probably around feeds and speeds. It's probably product-driven as opposed to solution-driven, and they focus on the use and repair of the product within their training and service departments. Now, if I'm thinking more about solutions, I'm probably going to begin to try to divide those customers into particular vertical markets to promote specific business benefits. I'm going to hire my systems and applications engineers to be able to sell and support within those particular verticals and to sell what new problems can be solved with the salespeople. And then the training and service people are going to be involved in supporting those new applications. So as you look at this, you can begin to see there are some specific leading edge indicators. Have I identified the specific vertical markets? Have I identified the solutions? Am I beginning to get queries or requests for proposal back that show that the customer is beginning to understand the new arguments that I'm making? As I observe my salespeople or my service people in the field, are they beginning to sell from a solution perspective as opposed to continuing to just sell performance parameters? You can concentrate on some of these as specific leading indicators so that you begin to get an idea of whether the change is taking hold even before you can measure things like product sales or customer satisfaction. Now, here's some other leading indicators. For the leadership team, it's a bigger pipeline with customer projects. For the sales and service managers, it may be new alliances. If I'm trying to sell into specific vertical markets, I may need to do work with value-added resellers that have software, for example, that will help me to be successful in those niches. For the salespeople, have they developed account plans that show specific knowledge of customer needs? And then have the training and service techs become certified in specific systems and applications that will help in those niches? Lagging indicators might be combining revenues exceeding that of the standalone company, market share by vertical, the value that customers realize from getting solutions in this way, and support contracts, service contracts that begin to reflect the realities of the new arrangements that people are making. So those are some of the things that you can use, a concrete way, again, to go through and think about how you can implement changes like this across an organization by many different functions. So let's talk a bit about how do we foster this kind of engagement. Let me just give you a flavor of some research on the drivers of engagement using some employee surveys that I have access to from organizations of larger than 5,000 people around the world. One of the questions that the surveyor asked in this particular case was trying to get people to figure out whether they agreed or strongly agreed to all the statements in each of the columns above. So one column was related to intensity of performance, and one was related to intensity of commitment. So for example, you can see the statements on the left. I'm willing to work hard, especially hard for my organization's customers. I feel an obligation to work as hard as I can for my organization. I actively look for ways to improve the way I work. I've often been recognized as a top performer in my organization. Working here brings out my best ideas. So you can measure the intensity of that within an employee population. And then at the same time, on the commitment side, I'm not planning to leave this organization for the next 12 months. I do not wish I was working somewhere else. I'm proud to work at my organization. I would recommend this organization as a great place to work. You can use these kinds of surveys to determine whether people are going to be engaged and whether they're going to be loyal, whether they're going to stay. And in fact, there are organizations now that are doing these kinds of surveys on a regular and periodic basis. If you do them over a large enough group of people, you can use the averages to begin to get pulse on the organization for both of these areas. Here's an example of how that commitment sometimes plays out among job types. As you can see, the executives and the senior managers tend to be much more committed, not surprisingly, than the rest of the people in the organization. Think about what that means when you're trying to convince somebody who's at the operations level or at the trades and production level of your organization to do something that you're already heavily committed to. What are the things that you're going to have to keep in mind as you begin to try to make that change? So again, asking you to think about this for a moment. What are the different engagement tactics that you may have used last year and this year? And what specific drivers of change were there in your organization? If you were doing this with a team of people, you could start out by listing the key engagement tactics that you're using today. And then maybe do an exercise where you post those up on a whiteboard or a wall and talk with your team about what you're proud of, and maybe on the other side of the ledger what you're sorry about, while having these mirrors of change up in front of you. If they can begin to see the 5 customer experience moments, if they can begin to see the specific kinds of leading and lagging indicators in the organization, and the specific engagement tactics that you have used, whether it's communications, learning, incentives, rewards and recognition, policies and procedures, or measures and accountability, I think they're going to be able to take a self-inventory that will help them think about what to do next. So we've talked about a number of mirrors of change, and I just listed several of them. Once you've taken that inventory of what you want to do, and you've assessed both your desired future and your current state, now you're ready to engage your own plan, to create your own engagement plan, as it were. Here again are those steps that we talked about earlier. I think there's an evaluation and assessment process initially that can be very helpful. Sometimes I'll interview people in an organization before gathering them together, because I often find that people will tell me things or will tell an interviewer like me things that they may not be willing to express publicly in the organization. There are ways to bring that information forward in a confidential way so that the whole organization can chew on it without having one member feel really uncomfortable for having shared that. And then often you put together or organize a meeting where you have people think through what it is that you're trying to accomplish. I often call that a stakeholders meeting, to confirm the parameters of a particular project and to develop the kind of conceptual models that we've been talking about. Then you may have a larger group come together for a design conference where you pull in people from all levels of the organization who are going to be involved in the change to help you design the solution. The good thing about that is that it actually gives people a stake in the game, so that when you come back to them and you're ready to actually implement, they're going to recognize elements of that plan and what you're asking them to do, that they got a chance, if you will, to sign off on it right from the beginning. And then finally, you're going to have to take that plan to whoever is within power and influence in your organization to be able to approve that concept. Ideally, you will have identified resistance. You'll have this plan in writing, so it's something that can be measured. And then you'll think through, how do I create focus around some specific launch events to be able to get people's attention to go through that initial stage of change. Then you'll want to decide how you're going to measure and continue to evangelize or sustain the plan. and adjust it as you go forward as you learn more and more about it. The building products example that I gave you earlier, we ran a pilot of this 7-page business plan that we designed to help these branches of this building products company basically do strategic planning at the branch level. We ran the pilot because we knew no matter how much we've done this before with other companies, there were always things to learn. And it turned out that we adjusted that planning process significantly based on the first meeting and got much better and, in fact, improved results meeting by meeting as we went around the country to the point that we really were able to celebrate quite a win for the organization by the time that we finished with it. So again, to summarize, here are the 5 drivers of change. Creating awareness through communication, developing skills through learning and training, integrating changes into policies and procedures, building recognition through, or building desire, I should say, through recognition and rewards, and then finally sustaining the change through measurement. Here's another way to think about how you might launch and sustain a change. Sometimes I'll think about during the course of an assignment, how do we unfreeze ineffective behavior, sometimes just by creating heat in the organization or shining a light on a part of the organization that hasn't been seen for a while. You want to make sure that your goals are aligned and that you've introduced accountability between the different silos. Then you want to analyze the definitions and processing and use of the information. Once you've been able to figure out what the ineffective behaviors are, then you can introduce new strategies that allow you to engage and define value. And that's where you might use training, and you might use employee engagement with communications. Effective monitoring systems to do some of the things that we've been talking about, tracking the change. Getting to the point where the change is a part of the rhythm of the business. And at that point, you're actually going to want to refreeze the system. You're going to want to be able to get to the point where you can install a platform for measurement and tracking a change, and then use recognition and rewards to be able to drive appropriate behaviors. So this is one way to think about a change management model that unfreezes ineffective behaviors, refreezes effective ones after you've engaged the employees and helped them define value in the things that you want them to do differently. Another model that I sometimes use, which I think might be useful, you can think about traditional engagement projects as highly focused on the kind of launch event that I talked about earlier. The problem with launch events is that people tend to put so much energy and expense into them that they don't always have a lot of time left over to do anything else. And the research shows that a year later, only about 3 to 5% of what was communicating during the launch is still retained by the audience, by the people who were supposed to be involved in the change process. Now, I believe that you can change that by populating both before and after the launch a series of activities that build that awareness and understanding on the front end, and then that build buy-in and ownership to sustain behavior over time. And again, the research shows that with doing that, with the kinds of engagement tools that we've been discussing, along with performance management and coaching, you can raise the level of knowledge that's retained and the impact of the change. Finally, I want to talk briefly about this chart. This is an example of the kinds of relationships that you may see between business partners and the evolution between business partners. It assumes that trust is a function of shared accountability for joint business activities. So the chart actually shows 4 stages of partnership, from transactional relationships based on price, to full partnerships with an aligned business strategy, deep interpersonal relationships between the principals, and sharing of data and learning, along with regular periods of evaluation of progress and planning for the future. I'd like to invite you to think about, if you think about the partnership relationships that you have with your business, where are you with your customers or with your partners on this kind of a spectrum? And I want to emphasize that there's no one right place to be. I know, for example, with some customers, their culture is so strongly transactional. They tend to be so focused on just making sure that they have the best price or the best terms that you could invest in some of the tactics that we're looking at up through these other kinds of cooperative arrangements and never get the return on investment because the customer or the partner just won't go there with you. So I'm very cognizant of the fact that no one stage is the right stage for all customers or for all partners. What I'm suggesting is that this is a good tool to be able to think about, A, where you are currently, and then B, what the potential or possibilities for change are with that particular partner or customer, and what it would do to actually, what it would take to actually get there, what sorts of joint business activities might actually build a trust level if you decide that you want to move more towards a full partnership kind of system. So what have we learned? There are big rewards if you have patience and plan. You can identify and realize new business opportunities and collaborations. You can identify and resolve key alignment and engagement issues. You can identify and articulate credible mutual business value and communicate that value to your employees and to customers. You can build trust through consistent follow-up. And then finally, you can achieve your business and performance objectives. Change management work requires a diverse set of skills: planning, project management, a keen observer's eye and ear, a gift for knowing when to introduce aspects of change, and a practical bent that keeps the change process from being perceived as just theoretical or abstract. So I hope this has been helpful to you today. I leave you with a series of publications or talks on the web that I have found particularly helpful in doing this kind of work. Many of you may know Edwards Deming, W. Edwards Deming, who's kind of the father of the quality movement. This 14 points of management actually dates back to the 1950s. But in many ways, his ideas for working with organizations and creating change for better quality are as fresh as they were when they were invented. Many of you may also have heard of a guy named Simon Sinek who does a TED Talk called The Power of Why that I think is particularly helpful when you're trying to create change inside organizations. John Cotter is a leading scholar. He's at Harvard Business School and has written many books on leading change and on organizational behavior. Patrick Lencioni is an author who has written a book, several books actually. One of the ones that I think is most helpful is a business fable called The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team that I recommend to you not only for its value but also its readability. He's a terrific writer. And finally, a lot of what we've been talking about today comes from a scholar named Marvin Weisbord, who wrote a book quite a while back called Productive Workplaces that I think continues to be one of the real, if you really want to get deeper into the theory of this and how this works, it's a great place to go. So having gone through that, I think we have a few minutes left for questions, and I want to turn this back over to Kathy. I see one of the questions is, will we have access to this deck after the presentation? What I can do is to put a deck up on the Freeman+Leonard website, and you'll be able to go there and download it if you like.
Yes, that's correct. Thank you, Steve, so much. We don't see any other questions at this point, but we're happy to take your questions. Freeman+Leonard.com has a tab called Webinar. So if you would like to get a copy and download a copy of Steve's presentation today, you can do it at our website, www.freeman.leonard.com. Steve, this has been really interesting, and I think for companies who are doing strategic planning here in the fourth quarter, there are some great tools in here for initiating the change that planning predicts or intends as we move our companies to achieving the goals that we set out in strategic planning. So timing has been great. Thank you so much for that.
Well, you're welcome. And again, it was nice to be with all of you today. And feel free to reach out through Kathy if there's something more that I can do for one of your organizations.
Thank you so much. Steve is available for consulting purposes, and we would like to make that known to everyone. Also, this is the first of a series in our webinar, The Business of Marketing, and the next one will be in February, and we're calling that one a Client Agency Contracts and Relationship Management. Francisco Escobar will be leading that webinar. There will be another one in May, the New Search for Insights. The next one will be in August, Content Strategies that Work for Businesses and Consumer-Facing Brands. And then finally, we want to have a little bit of fun with the Business of Humor. And I believe that's going to be in November, a year from now. So anyway, thank you all for joining us. We appreciate it very much.